A dinner table, set for murder, and one guest won't leave alive. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing this mystery-loving community grow. Your presence makes every story richer. Let's begin. The male doesn't often try to get a rise out of the brownstone. It usually knows better. Bills go to the drawer, magazines go to the table near the globe, and things with embossed return addresses that smell like ambition end up in the wastebasket before Fritz can rescue the wrappers. On that particular Tuesday morning in November, the envelopes behaved themselves until one of them didn't. I was halfway through updating the orchid germination records when Fritz appeared in the office doorway, holding a cream-colored envelope like it might bite him. Fritz Brenner, who could maintain his composure while serving soufflé to a table of arguing politicians, was actually frowning at a piece of mail. "Archie," he said, his German accent thicker than usual. "This arrived by special messenger. The young man insisted it was urgent and would not leave until I signed for it personally." I looked up from my typewriter. Nero Wolfe wouldn't descend from the plant rooms for another hour and 20 minutes, and anyone who'd spent more than 5 minutes in our brownstone on West 35th Street knew that disturbing his morning communion with the orchids was tantamount to suggesting he switched to instant coffee. The envelope was thick, white, and soft like expensive napkin that had been pressed by someone who expected applause. No return address, but the paper stock alone probably cost more than most people's lunch. I ran my thumb under the flap and slid out a single card with raised black type and a watermark that caught the morning light like fish scales. At the top, in elegant script, Rustermans beneath it in bold capitals, "Menu of Death." "Well," I said to Fritz, "that's one way to solve the reservation problem." Fritz made a small sound that indicated he preferred not to hear about death in connection with kitchens or dining rooms. "Mr. Wolfe has finished with the cattleyas," he said carefully. "If you're taking that to him, perhaps use a tray. Fine paper can leave stains." I took the tray, because you pick your battles with Fritz the way you pick your neckties with Wolfe, very carefully. The card deserved a closer look anyway. The courses were laid out like a military campaign. Amuse-bouche, quince, and coriander. First course, scallop crudo with green apple and fennel pollen. Second, sweetbreads with Madeira and capers. Third, squab with black garlic. Cheese course, then a chocolate tart with blood orange sorbet. Each line had a tiny italicized note in the margin, like whispered secrets, under the sweetbreads. In memory of a master. Under the squab, for the one who never forgave. Under the chocolate. Your last taste should be honest. But it was the note under the amuse-bouche that made me sit up, straighter. Quince in the Montenegrin manner. In the office, Wolfe's massive form occupied the custom-built chair behind his desk, like a mountain that had found its proper place in the landscape. He had a book open on his knees and a glass of beer beside him, the foam climbing the sides like determined mountaineers. When I entered, he marked his place with a thin strip of paper, closed the volume, and glanced at the card in my hand without moving anything but his eyes. "If that's a menu," he said in his rumbling baritone, "it is badly named." "Depends on your appetite." I set the tray down and positioned the card where he could read it without shifting his considerable bulk. Over the years, I've learned that accommodating Wolfe's natural aversion to unnecessary movement saves considerable argument. He read the heading, and nothing moved except the corners of his mouth. "Ha! Marketing." That's what I thought. I cleared my throat and indicated the individual courses. Until I got to the fine print. His eyes moved to the amuse-bouche line, and I watched his expression change almost imperceptibly. The phrase, Montenegrin manner, hung in the air between us like the scent of something burning in a distant kitchen. Fritz had followed me in with a silent efficiency that only men who truly understand butter can achieve. He leaned forward, reading over Wolfe's shoulder, and I saw his eyebrows rise at the quince reference. "You know this preparation," Wolfe said to Fritz. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. From the old country. My grandmother's method, though she learned it from Marco," Wolfe finished quietly. He took a careful breath that expanded his considerable chest, then released it with the precision of a man who understands that some memories require delicate handling. "Show me the reverse, Archie." I flipped the card. The back contained a note written in the kind of careful script that suggested either excellent penmanship lessons or considerable nervousness. "Mr. Wolfe, you do not accept invitations. This one accepts you. Tonight at 9 o'clock. Table 6 in the Blue Room, if you will prove a kindness to the dead and a caution to the living. There is a chair at Table 6 reserved for the killer. You will not need to stand. C.G." I turned the card back over and tried not to smile. Anyone who knew Wolfe understood that a direct appeal to his legs was pointless, but an indirect appeal to his vanity and his sense of intellectual challenge had been known to work miracles. "Do we know a C.G.?" I asked. "We know several," Wolfe replied, reaching for his beer with the measured precision of a man performing a ritual, "but only one whose letterhead would be Rustermann's." He took a sip, set the glass down in exactly the same spot where the ring on his desk blotter waited, and shifted one finger toward the phone. "Celia Garros, acting manager." "Get her." "Acting manager," I repeated. "What happened to the tall fellow with the apologetic? Mustache?" "Zurich," Wolfe said with the dismissive tone he reserved for unnecessary travel. "Miss Garros has the misfortune of being competent enough to be left in charge during his absence." He paused, studying the card again. "How does the paper smell?" I leaned closer. "Expensive, also like someone handled it with nervous fingers." Fritz departed with a look that suggested he had strong opinions about people who use death as dinner conversation, and I placed the call. Rustermann's answered on the second ring with the kind of professional warmth that costs extra, made me hold for exactly the right amount of time, and finally connected me to Ms. Garros. Her voice had the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to managing both temperamental chefs and demanding customers. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been expecting your call." "Have you now, and why might that be?" "Because I sent that card to Mr. Wolfe, and because I need his help." A pause. "May I come to see him? There are things I cannot discuss over the telephone." "He'll see you at 6 o'clock, I said, making the appointment without consulting Wolfe because sometimes maintaining staff morale requires small acts of faith. "Thank you." "And Mr. Goodwin, when you examine that card more carefully, you'll notice the paper has been handled by at least 3 different people. The scents are quite distinct if you know what to look for." She hung up before I could ask what she meant by that, leaving me staring at a piece of expensive cardstock that was apparently more complicated than it looked. Wolfe had been listening to my end of the conversation with the focused attention he usually reserved for Fritz's daily menu recitations. When I hung up, he was already reaching for the magnifying glass he kept in the top drawer. "The Montenegrine preparation," he said, examining the card under the lens, "is not a recipe one encounters in restaurant kitchens. It requires a specific technique that was taught to very few people." He set down the magnifier and looked at me directly. "Marko Vukcic knew it. He taught it to Fritz and to perhaps 2 other people in this city, one of whom is apparently planning a dinner party with a morbid theme. Or," Wolfe said quietly, "someone who wishes me to believe that Marco's memory is being used for purposes he would not have approved." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression I recognized. The look of a man who has decided that his personal comfort is less important than settling a score. "Call Saul Panzer," he said. "Tell him to be near Rustermann's at 8:30 tonight, not inside. Observing. I want to know who arrives for this dinner and whether any of them seem surprised to find themselves there." "You're going to accept their invitation?" "No," Wolfe said firmly. I will not leave this office to watch strangers perform theater over food. But you will go in my place, Archie. You will sit at their table 6 and observe their little drama and determine whether someone is planning mischief or merely seeking attention. And if it's mischief, then you will prevent it, he said with the calm certainty of a man who has never doubted my ability to handle such situations. Fritz will prepare dinner here at 7. After we eat, you will go to Rustermann's and represent my interests. Any particular instructions for representing your interests? Wolfe picked up the card one final time, studying the line about quince in the Montenegrin manner. Yes, he said. Do not eat anything you did not order yourself. And Archie, if someone at that table knows enough about Marko Vukcic to reference his cooking methods, they know enough about me to understand that using his memory as bait is an act of considerable presumption. He set the card down and reached for his book, signaling that the interview was over. But I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant someone had made this personal. At 5 minutes to 6, I was positioned in the front hall with the door slightly ajar, watching the street for Ms. Garros. She arrived precisely on time, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate both kitchen chaos and dining room politics. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested she took herself seriously, and she wore a charcoal suit that managed to look both professional and slightly dangerous. In the office, she declined the red leather chair that makes honest people comfortable and dishonest people nervous, choosing instead to remain standing until Wolfe gestured her toward the seat with the kind of nod that suggested she had passed some preliminary test. Mr. Wolfe, she said without preamble, someone is planning to use my dining room tonight for something that has nothing to do with food, and I believe they chose Rustermann's specifically because they knew it would draw you into their scheme. Indeed, Wolfe rumbled. And what makes you believe this? She opened a slim portfolio and withdrew another copy of the menu card, this one in a protective plastic sleeve. This arrived at the restaurant this afternoon by messenger. 6 copies with instructions to place one at each setting for tonight's private party in the Blue Room. And you chose to send one to me instead. I chose to warn you, she corrected. The reservation was made 3 weeks ago. 6 covers, private dining room, menu to be selected by the chef with one specific request, that the amuse-bouche feature quince prepared in what they called the traditional Montenegrin style. Wolfe's fingers, which had been drumming silently on his desk, went completely still. And you know this preparation? I know enough to understand that it's not something one requests casually, she said. It's a technique that requires specific knowledge and considerable skill. When I asked our chef about it, he said he'd never heard of it but would research the method. Who made the reservation? A woman who identified herself as Daphne Reeve. She said she was hosting a small dinner for investors and food critics, and she specifically requested our most private dining room. Ms. Garros paused. She also asked whether we had any connection to Marko Vukcic. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time. Wolfe's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had shifted, like a mountain settling before an avalanche. I see, he said finally. And tonight's guest list? 6 people. Miss Reeve herself. She's apparently some sort of investment consultant. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the food critic. Victoria Sterling, who owns several restaurants in the city. Marcus Webb, a food photographer. Elena Rodriguez from the Culinary Institute, and... She hesitated slightly. Jasper Quine. Ah, Wolfe said, as if a piece of particularly unpleasant news had just confirmed his worst suspicions. The franchise specialist. Among other things, he's been making inquiries about acquiring an interest in Rustermann's. Quiet inquiries, but persistent ones. I was taking notes, but I could see that Wolfe was already several moves ahead in whatever game was being played. His eyes had taken on the focused intensity he usually reserved for particularly challenging crossword puzzles or especially complex murder cases. Ms. Garros, he said, what do you know about Marko Vukcic? Only that he was the previous owner of Rustamans, and that he died several years ago, and that his name still carries considerable weight in certain circles. Indeed it does. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which creaked softly under his weight. Marko was my oldest friend. He was also a man who inspired both great loyalty and, occasionally, great resentment. If someone is using his memory and his restaurant to set a trap, they have chosen their bait very carefully indeed. Then you'll help? I will attend to the matter, Wolfe said, which wasn't quite the same thing as agreeing to help, but was close enough for government work. My fee is $50 a day plus expenses. Archie will represent my interests at tonight's dinner. You won't come yourself? I will not leave this office to watch amateurs perform dramatics over dinner, he said with finality. But if there is genuine mischief afoot, it will be addressed. After Ms. Garros left, I turned to Wolfe, who was studying the menu card again with the kind of attention he usually reserved for rare orchids or particularly fine meals. So we're going to crash a dinner party where someone may be planning murder, mayhem, or just an elaborate practical joke, I said. Just another typical Tuesday in the Wolfe household. Not crash, Archie. Attend. There is a difference. He set the card down and looked at me directly. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to arrange this evening's entertainment. They have used Marko's name, his restaurant, and his recipes as props in their little drama. That suggests either great audacity or great desperation. Or both. Indeed. Which is why you will be armed tonight, and why Saul will be watching from the street, and why I will be here, available by telephone, should the evening prove more eventful than anticipated. He reached for his book, signaling that the preliminary discussion was over. But as I headed for the door, he called after me. Archie. Yes? The quince preparation Marko taught to Fritz. It requires a very specific type of honey. Montenegrin wildflower honey, aged in oak for at least 2 years. There are perhaps 3 sources for such honey in all of New York City. You want me to check on recent purchases? I want you to understand, he said quietly, that whoever planned tonight's menu knows things about Marko that were not common knowledge. This is not the work of a casual enemy or an opportunistic criminal. This is personal. I nodded and headed for the kitchen to tell Fritz about our dinner plans. In the hallway, I paused to check the 38 in the drawer of the hall table. If tonight was going to be personal, I wanted to be prepared for any eventuality. After all, in my experience, when someone goes to the trouble of planning a menu of death, they usually have more in mind than just serving bad food. The afternoon stretched ahead like a cat planning mischief. I spent the first hour tracking down the honey suppliers Wolfe had mentioned, which turned out to be about as straightforward as explaining modern art to a Puritan. Kostic at Balkan Pantry remembered selling a jar that morning to a young woman with expensive shoes and nervous hands. She'd paid cash and asked specifically about the aging process. Leka at Adriatic Provisions grumbled that he hadn't seen Montenegrin stock in months, but the boutique shop on Madison, Delacroix and Sons proved more illuminating. The clerk there had a memory like a filing cabinet and twice the organization. A woman had called 3 days ago, asking about oak-aged Montenegrin honey, at least 2 years old. She'd been particular about the aging process and had arranged delivery to an address on East 73rd Street. Fussy about her honey, that one, he told me. Said it was for a very special recipe that couldn't be compromised. Paid the delivery boy to wait while she opened the jar and smelled it. I made a note of the address and decided it warranted investigation before dinner. In the kitchen, I found Fritz preparing what appeared to be enough food for a small battalion, humming something Wagnerian while he worked. When I mentioned the Montenegrin quince preparation, his knife paused mid-slice and his expression darkened. Marko, he said quietly, the single name carrying the weight of old friendship and fresh insult. That recipe is not for public consumption, Archie. It is a memory, a private one." He wiped his hands with the deliberate care of a man, controlling his temper. "For someone to use it in this manner, it is more than presumption. It is desecration." At 4:15, I took a walk past the East 73rd Street address. The building was a modest brownstone divided into apartments, respectable but not ostentatious. The nameplate beside the third-floor buzzer confirmed what I'd suspected. D. Reeve. Our dinner hostess lived within comfortable walking distance of the gourmet honey shop. As I was preparing to leave, the lady herself emerged from the building. Daphne Reeve looked younger than I'd expected. Early 30s, with auburn hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested more time spent with ledgers than sunlight. She moved with purpose, but checked her watch twice in the first block, the nervous habit of someone running on a tight schedule. I followed at a reasonable distance as she headed toward Madison Avenue. At 68th Street, she ducked into a small cafe and took a window table. I positioned myself across the street with a clear view and settled in to watch. At 4:45, a tall man with prematurely gray hair joined her. They didn't embrace or shake hands. This was business, not pleasure. Their conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes. She did most of the talking, referring frequently to papers from a leather portfolio. He listened with the focused attention that money commands. Near the end, she slid something across the table. Small, brass, unmistakably a key, and he pocketed it without examination. When they parted, she headed toward Rustermann's while he walked north. I had a choice: follow the mysterious key recipient or stick with our dinner hostess. Professional instinct suggested the hostess was the primary target, but as I started after her, something made me glance back. The tall man had stopped at the corner and was looking directly at me with the kind of recognition that makes experienced investigators reach for their weapons. We stared at each other across 50 feet of Manhattan's sidewalk. Then he smiled, not pleasantly, and melted into the crowd. I made it back to the brownstone by 5:15, with enough time to brief Wolfe before dinner. He listened to my report with the kind of attention he usually reserved for Fritz's menu descriptions, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. "The key," he said when I finished. "Small and brass, you said." "That's right. The kind that might open a desk drawer or filing cabinet." "Or a wine cellar," Wolfe mused. "Rustermann's has an extensive collection in the basement. Access is normally restricted to management and senior staff." "You think she's planning something more elaborate than dinner theater?" "I think someone has invested considerable time and money in tonight's entertainment. The honey alone represents a significant expense. Add the private dining room, custom menus, and theatrical presentation, and we are looking at an operation that suggests serious purpose." At 7:30, I excused myself to prepare for the evening's adventure. The .38 went into the shoulder holster, along with a spare clip and the small recording device Wolfe insisted I carry, for occasions when testimony might later prove important. I called Saul, who confirmed he'd be in position by 8:30, then checked my watch and headed for the door. "Archie?" Wolfe called as I reached the hall. "Yes?" "Remember that Marco would not have approved of violence in his restaurant. Handle any difficulties with appropriate discretion. And Archie, the wine cellar has a second exit through the alley, should circumstances require alternative departure arrangements." I nodded and stepped out into the November evening, wondering exactly what kind of dinner party required knowledge of emergency exits and backup escape routes. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe starts planning for contingencies, the evening is guaranteed to prove more interesting than the menu would suggest. The city had settled into its evening rhythm, that particular Manhattan blend of ambition and exhaustion that makes 8 o'clock feel like both the beginning and end of something important. As I walked toward Rustermann's, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's menu of death was going to serve up considerably more than quince and theatrical pretension. Rustermann's at 8:45 wore its evening elegance like a well-tailored dinner jacket. comfortable, expensive, and designed to make everyone inside feel slightly more important than they actually were. The doorman, whose military bearing suggested he'd seen action in places that didn't make the society pages, nodded as I approached with the kind of recognition that money and Nero Wolfe's reputation could buy. Inside, the maitre d' guided me through the main dining room with the practiced discretion of a funeral director who understood that some conversations required soundproofing. The blue room occupied a corner of the second floor, separated from the general population by thick walls and the kind of privacy that allowed important people to discuss unimportant things without fear of eavesdropping. Before I could settle into the evening's entertainment, my phone buzzed. Saul's voice came through with the clarity of a man who'd found his position and intended to keep it. "Blue room has a private entrance through the service corridor," he reported. 6 guests arriving in pairs and singles, staggered timing. One of them clocked you from half a block away. Tall, gray at the temples, using a critic's eye on the pedestrian traffic. "Dr. Blackwood," I said. "Stay with the exits, especially that alley door Wolfe mentioned. Something tells me the cellar might become popular tonight." "Already watching," Saul confirmed, and the line went quiet. Celia Garros materialized at my elbow with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate both kitchen chaos and dining room politics. She'd changed into black silk with a silver pin. Understated elegance that said she understood subtlety made the room, not chandeliers. "Good evening, Mr. Goodwin. Table 6 is prepared. Your place setting is positioned to observe both entrances, as Mr. Wolfe would prefer." "Keep the service deliberate," I told her. "Fast enough to prevent improvisation, slow enough to let me watch the show." Her expression tightened slightly. "About that, we discovered an irregularity. The secondary cellar key is missing from the office, and there are scuff marks near the alley door lock. Someone's been using our basement." I filed that information under complications and followed her into the blue room. The space was intimate without being cramped, lit by sconces that cast warm shadows on paneled walls. A circular table dominated the center, dressed in white linen and set for 6 with the kind of crystal and silver that suggested tonight's budget had been generous. Each place setting displayed one of the death-themed menu cards, and someone had positioned white lilies and black roses at the table's center. Subtlety, apparently, wasn't on the evening's agenda. More interesting was the wine selection, a 1947 Chateau d'Yquem that probably cost more than most people's cars, along with several bottles I recognized as particular favorites of Marko Vukcic. The guests had begun arriving with military punctuality. Daphne Reeve entered first, now dressed in black silk that managed to look both elegant and vaguely funeral. She surveyed the table with satisfaction, made a minute adjustment to one wine glass, and claimed the seat that commanded the best view of both entrances, a detail that suggested she understood the evening might require strategic positioning. Dr. Harrison Blackwood followed, moving with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that dining rooms could be professional battlefields. The food critic was smaller than his newspaper photographs suggested, with pale eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of thin smile that made experienced waiters nervous. He examined his place setting with a jeweler's attention to detail, then nodded approvingly at the wine selection. Victoria Sterling made an entrance that suggested considerable practice in the art of commanding attention. The restaurant owner wore burgundy velvet and enough jewelry to stock a small shop, moving through the room with the fluid grace of someone who understood that dining was performance art. She kissed the air near Daphne's cheek, offered Dr. Blackwood a handshake that lingered just long enough to establish hierarchy, and settled into a chair like a queen claiming her throne. Marcus Webb arrived with the distracted efficiency of someone who saw everything through camera lenses. The food photographer was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with nervous energy that suggested too much caffeine and not enough sleep. He positioned his chair for optimal lighting, pulled out a small notebook, and began sketching the table arrangement with quick, practiced strokes. Elena Rodriguez from the Culinary Institute entered quietly, her understated confidence suggesting genuine expertise rather than public relations. She was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked dark hair and hands that showed years of serious kitchen work. She nodded politely to the assembled group, but remained silent, her dark eyes cataloguing details the others had missed. At 9 o'clock precisely, the final guest arrived. Jasper Quine strode in with the confidence of a man accustomed to making entrances, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. His silver hair was professionally styled, and his smile had the practiced warmth that successful predators cultivate. He surveyed the table like a general reviewing troops, his gaze lingering on each guest before settling on me with obvious curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daphne announced as our server appeared with the first course, "welcome to what I hope will be a memorable evening. Before we begin, I should mention we have an unexpected guest." She indicated me with a gesture that managed to be both gracious and slightly threatening. "Mr. Archie Goodwin, representing the interests of Nero Wolfe." The silence that followed carried enough tension to power a small generator. Finally, Dr. Blackwood spoke with academic precision that made simple observations sound like indictments. How fascinating. And what, exactly, are Mr. Wolfe's interests in tonight's gathering? "Professional curiosity," I replied, accepting a glass of the Chateau d'Yquem from our nervous server. "He finds it interesting when people use the names and recipes of dead friends for theatrical purposes." Jasper Quine laughed, a sound like ice cubes in expensive crystal. "Theatrical. My dear Mr. Goodwin, I think you'll find tonight's entertainment considerably more substantial than theater." The amuse-bouche arrived as he spoke. 6 small portions of quince prepared in what was unmistakably the Montenegrin manner, the honey glaze catching the candlelight like amber. The aroma was exactly as Fritz had described. Complex, haunting, carrying memories of mountain meadows and old friendships. But something about the presentation nagged at me. The spoons were slightly different from the restaurant's usual service pieces, and the garnish showed a precision that suggested hands more experienced than the nervous young man serving us. I excused myself briefly, ostensibly to check my coat, and found Celia near the service station. "That amuse-bouche?" I said quietly. "Your kitchen's work." Her expression confirmed my suspicions. "Our chef prepared a quince canapé from a cookbook reference. What you're being served came from somewhere else. 5 minutes before service, someone accessed the blue room through the service corridor and left a covered tray on the gerudon. The pantry staff assumed it was ours." "The missing cellar key," I said, and watched her nod. "My sommelier swears he's been in the wine cellar for the past hour with the master key, conducting inventory. But someone used that secondary key to access the building through the alley entrance." I returned to find Elena Rodriguez leaning forward slightly, inhaling the amuse-bouche with professional appreciation. "Remarkable," she murmured. "I haven't encountered this preparation in 20 years. The technique is very specific, not something you'd find in cookbooks." "Family recipe," Daphne said smoothly. But I caught the slight hesitation that suggested rehearsal, passed down through several generations. Despite Wolfe's warning about eating nothing I hadn't ordered, I found myself facing a professional dilemma. This wasn't just food, it was evidence. Carefully prepared bait designed to hook a very particular fish. To understand the trap, I needed to understand the bait. I lifted the spoon, inhaled the complex aroma, and tasted Marco's memory. The flavor was perfect, sweet, tart, with the deep, earthy note of aged Montenegrin honey that spoke of genuine expertise and considerable expense. Someone had gone to extraordinary trouble to recreate this dish exactly, which raised questions about their sources, their motivations, and their ultimate objectives. Victoria Sterling raised her wine glass in what felt more like a challenge than a toast. To old recipes and older secrets, may they both serve their proper purposes tonight. As we lifted our glasses, I noticed that Marcus Webb wasn't drinking. His wine sat untouched while his eyes moved constantly around the table, cataloging details with professional intensity. Elena Rodriguez sipped thoughtfully but kept her attention on the food, her culinary instincts apparently overriding whatever social dynamics were playing out. My phone hummed discreetly. I stepped toward the service entrance and answered Wolfe's call. "The amuse-bouche was staged," I reported quietly. "Someone used the missing cellar key to access the building and substitute the real Montenegrin preparation for the restaurant's version." Elena Rodriguez recognized the technique immediately. The timing suggests coordination. Whoever did this knew exactly when the course would be served. "Of course." Wolfe's voice carried the calm certainty of a man whose suspicions were being confirmed. "The authenticity means our provocateur has access to specific knowledge and materials. The cellar access suggests the objective requires more than theatrical gestures. Observe carefully, Archie. If someone has gone to this trouble for the opening course, the evening's true purpose has yet to reveal itself." When I returned to the table, the first course was being served. Scallop crudo with green apple and fennel pollen. But my attention was drawn to a small detail. One of the menu cards had shifted position, and the theatrical killer placard that had been centered on the table was nowhere to be seen. Daphne's hands rested calmly in her lap, but I caught the faintest sheen on her fingertips. Sticky, sweet, with the unmistakable scent of honey and wood and carefully laid plans. The evening's true entertainment, it seemed, was just beginning. As the wine was poured and the conversation resumed its careful dance around unstated purposes, I found myself wondering exactly what kind of performance required authentic Montenegrin recipes, missing cellar keys, and a dinner guest who collected placards marked "killer" like souvenirs. In my experience, when someone goes to this much trouble to stage authenticity, they're usually planning something that's anything but theatrical. The scallop crudo arrived with the precision of a military operation, each plate positioned with mathematical exactness by our increasingly nervous server. The presentation was flawless. Paper-thin scallops arranged like fallen petals, green apple julienne providing acidic contrast, fennel pollen dusted with an artist's attention to detail. But it was the wine service that commanded my attention. Instead of continuing with the suspect Chateau d'Yquem, our sommelier appeared with a different vintage entirely, a 1989 Sancerre that made Dr. Blackwood's eyebrows rise in genuine surprise. He examined his glass with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, swirling the pale gold liquid with practiced precision. "Remarkable," he murmured, inhaling the bouquet. "I haven't encountered this vintage in 15 years. This is from Marko Vukcic's personal reserve, unless I'm very much mistaken." His pale eyes fixed on Daphne with renewed interest. "Ms. Reeve, your access to Mr. Vukcic's collection suggests resources beyond casual research." Daphne's smile carried the satisfaction of someone whose homework had been thorough. "I believe in authenticity, Dr. Blackwood. Tonight seemed to call for something genuinely commemorative of Mr. Vukcic's exceptional taste." Elena Rodriguez set down her fork with deliberate care, her dark eyes studying our hostess with new intensity. "Ms. Reeve, I'm curious about your connection to Marco. The recipes you've chosen, the wine selections, they suggest intimate knowledge of his personal preferences. Professional research doesn't typically extend to private cellars." "Thorough preparation," Daphne replied. But I caught the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested the conversation was approaching territory she'd hoped to navigate more carefully. Marcus Webb looked up from his sketching, his nervous energy suddenly focused. "Research into what, exactly? Because if this involves intellectual property rights, I should mention that several of these preparations are matters of legitimate business interest," Jasper Quine interrupted with the smooth authority of someone accustomed to legal discussions. "Recipes may be public domain, Mr. Webb, but techniques, presentations, and specific applications can have considerable commercial value." Victoria Sterling's laugh had the brittle quality of champagne glasses under pressure. How wonderfully naive, Marcus. As if ownership were merely a matter of legal documents. Some things belong to people regardless of what lawyers say. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I found myself cataloguing exits again. Main door, service corridor, and that alley entrance Wolfe had mentioned. The conversation was developing an edge that made experienced investigators check their weapons. Dr. Blackwood cleared his throat with academic authority. Perhaps we should address the obvious question. Ms. Reeve, you've assembled 6 people who all had professional relationships with Marko Vukcic. You've recreated his recipes with remarkable accuracy. You've gained access to his private wine reserves. What exactly are we celebrating here? Justice, Daphne said quietly, and the single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. She reached into her leather portfolio, the same one I'd observed at the cafe, and began distributing copies of what appeared to be legal documents. We're celebrating justice that's been delayed too long. Elena Rodriguez examined the papers with growing recognition. These are partnership agreements, recipe development contracts. Her voice carried surprise mixed with something that might have been old anger. I remember some of these discussions with Marko, but I thought the documentation had been discarded when our plans changed. Agreements don't disappear because circumstances change, Daphne observed. Legal obligations persist regardless of personal preferences or convenient memories. Dr. Blackwood studied the documents with the methodical attention he usually reserved for restaurant reviews. These appear to be photocopies of contracts and correspondence. Ms. Reeve, where are the originals? And more importantly, how did you acquire copies of what appear to be private agreements? Sources prefer confidentiality, she replied, but the slight hesitation suggested the question had touched a nerve. What matters is that these documents establish legitimate claims to portions of Marko's estate, claims that were never properly acknowledged or compensated. Jasper Quine set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. Ms. Reeve, are you proposing to challenge Marko's will in court? Because such proceedings can be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain in outcome. I'm proposing something more efficient, she said, her composure returning. A private settlement that acknowledges the legitimate claims of Marko's true collaborators. A redistribution of assets that reflects actual contributions rather than legal technicalities. The pieces were falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed trap. And if Mr. Wolfe declines to participate in such a settlement? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Daphne's smile carried all the warmth of a tax assessment. Then these documents become public record, along with other materials that might prove embarrassing to his reputation and damaging to his business interests. My phone buzzed discreetly. Saul's voice carried urgency. 3 men entered through the alley door 5 minutes ago. Professional movement, coordinated timing. Also, wine delivery van at the service entrance. 2 men with a heavy crate labeled Vintage Reserve. They're not here for dinner service. I excused myself briefly, ostensibly for the restroom, and found a quiet corner to update Wolfe. His response was immediate and certain. Blackmail, he said after I'd briefed him on the documents and demands. Sophisticated and well-researched, but ultimately pedestrian. Ms. Reeve has assembled people with legitimate grievances and is using their claims to construct leverage for financial compensation. The men Saul spotted? Insurance, in case persuasion proves insufficient. The wine delivery concerns me more. Someone is using the cellar access for purposes unrelated to dining. How are the other guests responding to this revelation? Mixed reactions. Elena Rodriguez seems genuinely surprised, but interested in the partnership documents. Dr. Blackwood is examining everything like evidence. Victoria Sterling appears to be enjoying the drama. Marcus Webb looks increasingly nervous, and Jasper Quine maintains professional neutrality. One of them is not what they appear to be, Wolfe said with certainty. The timing is too precise, the documentation too convenient. Someone at that table is working with Ms. Reeve, and someone else may be there for entirely different reasons. When I returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The legal documents were being passed around like evidence in a trial, and the conversation had acquired the focused intensity of people discovering that dinner entertainment involved considerably higher stakes than unusual menu choices. Victoria Sterling examined a partnership agreement with the attention of someone who understood fine print. This document predates Marco's opening of Rustermann's by 6 months. If genuine, it would give Elena significant claim to the restaurant's intellectual property and operational methods. Elena Rodriguez looked up from her copy, her expression mixing surprise with recognition. I remember these discussions. Marco and I explored opening a restaurant together, developing signature preparations, establishing operational protocols. When the partnership didn't materialize, I assumed all agreements had been voided. Legal documents don't void themselves, Daphne observed with satisfaction. Obligations persist regardless of changed circumstances or convenient assumptions. Marcus Webb's sketching had stopped entirely, his attention focused on something beyond our immediate conversation. "Does anyone else hear that?" he asked quietly. We listened. From somewhere below came the faint but unmistakable sound of movement. Deliberate, careful, but definitely human. Someone was in Rustermann's wine cellar, and they weren't conducting routine inventory. Dr. Blackwood set down his papers with academic precision. "Ms. Reeve, these documents raise interesting questions about Marco's estate, but they also raise questions about your methods. Private agreements, confidential correspondence, access to restricted wine collections. Your resources suggest backing beyond individual initiative." Before Daphne could respond, my phone buzzed again. Saul's text was brief but alarming. "Courier departing alley with wine satchel. Bottle bears Rustermann's inner cage markings. He didn't acquire it legally." The evening's true complexity was finally revealing itself. Someone had used Marco's memory, his restaurant, and his recipes to assemble 6 people around a table. But the real business involved considerably more than legal documents and recipe disputes. The wine cellar activity, the mysterious deliveries, the coordinated timing, this was an operation with multiple moving parts and objectives that extended far beyond dinner conversation. I caught Celia Garris's eye as she passed near our table. Her expression mixed professional concern with genuine alarm. The missing cellar key, the basement activity, and now evidence of unauthorized wine removal had clearly escalated beyond normal restaurant security concerns. The third course arrived as these realizations crystallized. Squab with black garlic, prepared with the same flawless technique as everything else on the menu of death. The inscription echoed in my memory. For the one who never forgave. Someone was using Marco's own recipes to construct an elaborate revenge scenario, but the targets and ultimate objectives remained frustratingly unclear. As I lifted my fork, I found myself wondering which of my dinner companions knew exactly what was happening in the basement, whether the estate challenge was genuine leverage or elaborate misdirection, and how long we had before the evening's true entertainment moved beyond legal documents and wine fraud into territory that might actually justify the menu's morbid title. In my experience, when someone orchestrates this level of complexity around a simple dinner party, they usually have considerably more ambitious plans than serving legal papers with the dessert course. The squab with black garlic arrived with the kind of precision that makes you appreciate the difference between cooking and artistry. The meat was tender enough to cut with harsh language, and the black garlic provided an earthy depth that spoke of patience and proper technique. But it was the wine service that commanded my attention. Another bottle from Marco's Reserve. This one a 1982 Barolo that made Jasper Quine's eyes narrow with what I was beginning to recognize as more than casual appreciation. Elena Rodriguez had barely touched her plate. Instead, She was studying the legal documents with the focused intensity of someone who'd found a flaw in a recipe she'd written herself. She held one of the partnership agreements closer to the candlelight, her brow furrowing in concentration. "This clause," she murmured, more to herself than to the table. "The wording about exclusive rights to derivative culinary works. I remember this being a major point of contention with Marco. He refused this language entirely." Jasper Quine leaned forward with practiced legal interest. "Memory can be imprecise about contractual language, Ms. Rodriguez. The nuances of legal terminology." "Not this nuance," Elena interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. Marco was adamant that creativity shouldn't be entirely owned by partnership agreements. "We spent hours revising this clause. What I'm looking at here is the original draft, the version he specifically rejected." The silence that followed had weight to it, like the moment before thunder. Daphne's composure, which had been as carefully constructed as her menu, showed its first real crack. "These are photocopies of documents provided to me," she said, speaking just a little too quickly. "I can only present what I received." Dr. Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with academic precision. "Provided by whom exactly? And why would someone present a rejected draft as a binding agreement?" Victoria Sterling's theatrical amusement evaporated, replaced by something sharper. "If the foundation documents are fraudulent, Ms. Reeve, your entire legal position collapses rather dramatically." I excused myself with a line about checking on the wine selection and found Celia near the service station. Her expression mixed professional concern with genuine alarm, never a good combination in restaurant management. "The wine situation has escalated," she reported quietly. "Someone accessed the inner cage and removed Marco's 1934 Romanée Conti. That bottle was his most prized possession, kept under separate lock and key." "The wine satchel's Saul spotted," I confirmed. "How many people have access to the inner cage?" "3, officially. But Mr. Goodwin, that's not the concerning part. The attendant found the cage lock picked professionally. No damage, no forced entry. Whoever did this has serious skills." I found a quiet corner and called Wolfe. "The legal documents are fraudulent," I reported, filling him in on Elena's discovery and the Romanée Conti theft. "Someone's been very thorough in their research, but made a critical error with the partnership language." "Predictable," Wolfe rumbled with satisfaction. "Forgers excel at reproducing appearance, but often stumble on content they don't fully understand." The Romanée Conti, however, elevates this beyond simple document fraud. That wine represented more than monetary value to Marco. It was a symbol of his achievement, his legacy. So we're looking at someone who wants to wound as well as profit. Indeed. The brass key Ms. Reeve transferred, you observed it was small, correct? Right, I assumed it. Was for general cellar access. The inner cage requires a specialized key, Archie. Much smaller than standard cellar access. Brass, rather than steel, with specific teeth patterns. If Miss Reeve had access to that key, her connection to this operation runs considerably deeper than she's indicated. From the basement came new sounds, deliberate, rhythmic movement that suggested systematic activity rather than casual theft. I updated Wolfe on the cellar situation and received instructions that were both specific and ominous. "Provoke Mr. Quine regarding wine authentication," Wolfe directed. His knowledge of Montenegrin techniques suggests expertise beyond casual investment research. When someone displays mastery they shouldn't possess, pride compels them to demonstrate it further. When I returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted from tense negotiation to something approaching open hostility. Elena was holding the altered document like evidence in a trial, while Daphne's careful composure showed increasing strain. "The question," I said, settling back into my chair, "is whether we're dealing with simple document fraud or something more sophisticated. Because that Romanée Conti that's gone missing from the cellar, someone knew exactly where to find it and how to access it." Jasper Quine's wineglass paused halfway to his lips. The Romanée Conti is missing. You know the bottle? I asked with casual interest. Any serious collector knows Marco's 1934 Romanée Conti, he replied smoothly. One of perhaps a dozen remaining bottles from that vintage, stored in temperature-controlled conditions, humidity-regulated, positioned to prevent sediment disturbance. Elena Rodriguez looked up sharply. Most investors don't know storage specifications for individual bottles, Mr. Quine. Most investors don't do their homework as thoroughly as I do. Homework on Burgundy storage requirements, I pressed, or homework on Marco's specific collection arrangements. The room went quiet except for the faint sounds from below. 3 distinct voices now, coordinating movement with professional efficiency. Quine's smile maintained its practiced warmth, but something behind his eyes had gone cold and calculating. My phone buzzed discreetly. Saul's text was brief but illuminating. Courier delivered satchel to Quine Hospitality Holdings warehouse. 3 men departed cellar via alley. Van remains with engine running. Celia appeared at my shoulder with another bottle, this one bearing Marco's distinctive inner cage label with handwritten notations. The 1947 Sauternes you requested, she announced, with Mr. Vukcic's personal authentication marks. I examined the bottle carefully, noting the grease pencil line on the punt that Wolfe had described. Perfect. Mr. Quine, as someone who appreciates proper authentication, perhaps you'd verify the provenance markings? He accepted the bottle with practiced ease, his fingers finding the authentication marks with suspicious accuracy. Marco's grease pencil notation, he observed, applied in 1997 after a shipment he deemed questionable. The inner cage label bears his personal inventory code. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear individual heartbeats. Elena Rodriguez stared at Quine with dawning comprehension. Those markings aren't common knowledge. They're not documented anywhere public. As I said, thorough research. No, Elena interrupted with quiet certainty. Those details were known only to Marco, his sommelier, and perhaps 2 other people. People who had legitimate access to his private collection. Victoria Sterling's laugh carried no humor. Mr. Quine, you've just demonstrated knowledge that no amount of research could provide. Unless, of course, your connection to Marco's collection is considerably more intimate than you've indicated. Daphne Reeves' careful facade finally cracked completely. This wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice tight with strain. The documents, the dinner, the legal pressure, it was supposed to be clean, professional. Clean. Marcus Webb looked up from his sketching, his nervous energy focused into something approaching anger. Document fraud and wine theft are clean. From below came the sound of a heavy door closing, the alley exit most likely. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental. Someone was managing this operation with military efficiency, and the dinner party was providing perfect cover for systematic theft of Marco's most valuable possessions. I caught Celia's eye and gestured toward the service corridor. She nodded and slipped away to secure the alley access, leaving me to manage an increasingly volatile situation where the legal blackmail was proving to be merely the opening course of a much more elaborate and dangerous meal. The 4th course arrived as these revelations settled over the table like smoke from a kitchen fire. Cheese service with accompaniments that included, inevitably, quince preserves prepared in the Montenegrin manner. The irony was becoming almost oppressive. We were eating Marco's memories while watching his legacy being systematically stolen and his reputation being used as leverage for fraud. Dr. Blackwood raised his wineglass with academic solemnity. To Marco Vukcic, who understood that some knowledge is earned rather than researched, and that authentic expertise cannot be counterfeited. As we lifted our glasses, I noticed that Jasper Quine's hand showed the slightest tremor. Elena Rodriguez was watching him with the focused attention of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew. and Daphne Reeve was looking toward the service entrance with a desperate expression of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing in real time. The cheese was excellent, but I found myself wondering whether we'd reach dessert before the evening's multiple deceptions converged into something that might actually justify calling this the menu of death. In my experience, when wine thieves, document forgers, and blackmailers all gather around the same table, the entertainment rarely concludes with polite conversation and coffee service. My phone hummed with another message from Wolfe. The trap is set. When the cheese course concludes, suggest examining the cellar to assess the theft damage. Mr. Quine's expertise will compel him to demonstrate his knowledge of the collection. Pride, Archie, is the most reliable bait for catching those who believe themselves cleverer than their circumstances. I pocketed the phone and prepared for what promised to be a very interesting descent into Rusterman's wine cellar, where the evening's true business was apparently being conducted while we dined on Marco's memories and watched his secrets being auctioned off one course at a time. The cheese course concluded with the kind of deliberate precision that precedes either revelation or violence. As our server cleared the final plates with hands that had developed a noticeable tremor, the staff had clearly absorbed the tension radiating from table 6 like heat from a kitchen fire. I made my suggestion with the casual air of someone proposing a brief tour of the wine selection. "Perhaps we should examine the cellar situation," I said, addressing the table generally but watching Jasper Quine with the focused attention usually reserved for suspects and unpaid bills. If valuable wine has been stolen, someone with Mr. Quine's evident expertise in authentication might help assess the scope of the damage. Quine's response was immediate and telling, too eager, like a man who'd just been invited to demonstrate his favorite magic trick. "Excellent suggestion, Mr. Goodwin. Proper inventory requires someone who understands Marco's specific cataloging methods." He rose with the confidence of a professor approaching his lectern. "The inner cage, particularly, demands careful examination." Elena Rodriguez stood as well, her expression mixing professional curiosity with something sharper. "I'd like to see Marco's collection again. It's been years since I had access to his private reserves, and I'm beginning to suspect there are details I should have paid more attention to." Daphne Reeve remained seated, her carefully constructed composure finally showing genuine cracks. "Is that really necessary? The wine service tonight has been adequate for our purposes." "Has it?" Victoria Sterling's smile carried all the warmth of December moonlight. "Because it seems to me that the wine service has been the most honest part of this entire evening." Dr. Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with academic precision. "Ms. Reeve, your reluctance to examine the alleged crime scene is curious. If your legal claims have legitimate merit, documenting additional criminal activity would only strengthen your position." Marcus Webb closed his sketchbook with a decisive snap that echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. "I'm going to the cellar. This whole evening has been performance art, and I want to see the stage where the real show has been happening." Celia appeared at my elbow with the timing of someone who'd been monitoring our conversation from a discreet distance. "The cellar access is through the service corridor," she said, producing her key ring with professional efficiency. "I should warn you, the lighting isn't optimal for casual viewing, and the temperature can be quite shocking after the warmth upstairs." As we moved toward the service entrance, I caught sight of Daphne's reflection in the antique mirror beside the door. Her face showed the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully orchestrated performance was unraveling faster than she could improvise new dialogue. More telling was her subtle hand movement toward her purse, a gesture that suggested she was considering options that extended beyond conversation and legal documents. The service corridor was narrow, utilitarian, and carried the sense of industrial cleaning supplies and old wood. Our footsteps echoed against tile as Celia led us to a heavy door, marked Private Staff Only. She selected a key with practiced efficiency, and we descended wooden stairs that creaked under our collective weight like the rigging of an old ship adjusting to changing weather. The main cellar was impressive in the way that serious money usually is. Rows of wine racks extending into carefully controlled shadows, bottles arranged with the mathematical precision of a library catalogue. The air was cool, still, and carried the complex aroma of aging wine, old wood, and something else. Something wrong that made experienced investigators reach instinctively for weapons. "Temperature's climbing," Elena observed, moving immediately to the thermostat mounted near the entrance. She tapped the dial with a knuckle, then crouched to examine the mechanism more closely. "There's something wedged under the control." She produced a thin brad, driven deliberately beneath the temperature dial's rim. "Sabotage. Someone wanted the collection to suffer heat damage." The implications hit the room like cold water. Dr. Blackwood removed his glasses, polishing them with the methodical care of someone processing unpleasant data. "Systematic sabotage to depreciate the collection's value. That converts petty theft into something approaching economic warfare." But it was the inner cage that commanded our primary attention, a separate enclosure with reinforced steel mesh, additional locks, and specialized lighting that highlighted the most valuable bottles like museum pieces. The lock showed no visible damage, but the subtle scoring near the keyway told the story of professional work by someone who understood that finesse left fewer traces than force. Jasper Quine approached the inner cage with familiarity that should have raised immediate alarms. His fingers traced the lock mechanism with practiced ease, and his eyes catalogued the remaining bottles with obvious expertise that extended far beyond casual research. "The Romanée Conti is indeed missing," he confirmed with satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for someone discovering theft. "Also gone are the 1929 Chateau d'Yquem and what appears to have been a bottle of 1947 Sauterne from Marco's personal reserve." He paused, studying the arrangement with professional attention. The selection wasn't random. These represent the crown jewels of the collection. Elena Rodriguez examined the empty spaces with growing recognition and mounting anger. Those bottles were Marco's most prized possessions. He showed them to me once, explained their provenance, their personal significance to his journey as a chef and restaurateur. She turned to Quine with sharp attention. "Mr. Quine, how do you know the specific vintages of the missing bottles?" Marco didn't label his inner cage collection with visible tags. "Thorough research," Quine replied with diminishing smoothness. "Any serious investor conducts comprehensive due diligence." "What kind of research tells you the exact positioning of bottles in a private collection?" I pressed, producing the folded inventory sheet Celia had provided. "Because this official inventory from last month shows the 1947 Sauternes in position 6 of the third rack. You just identified it as being in position 8. Quine's hesitation lasted exactly long enough to confirm guilt. Historical positioning. Marco's habits for certain bottles were well documented among serious collectors. Elena's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. "Mr. Quine, that positioning detail was known to exactly 3 people. Marco, his head sommelier, and me. It was never documented anywhere public because Marco believed some knowledge should remain private." I stepped closer to examine the empty rack space, noting details that professional thieves often overlooked. Behind where the Romanée Conti had rested, the dust pattern revealed something more than a missing bottle. There was a faint, rectangular outline, the shadow of a small wooden box that had been positioned behind the wine as additional security. "Elena," I said, indicating the dust pattern, "what was Marco keeping behind his most prized bottle?" Her expression shifted from anger to something approaching reverence. His chef's heart. That's what he called it, a small wooden box containing what he said was the essence of his culinary philosophy. Recipes, techniques, personal notes that represented his true legacy. He said it was more valuable than any wine because it contained the knowledge that couldn't be replicated or purchased. The silence that followed carried the weight of genuine violation. Someone hadn't just stolen valuable wine. They had taken the symbolic heart of Marco's professional legacy, the irreplaceable distillation of a lifetime's culinary wisdom. My phone buzzed with a call from Wolfe. I stepped away to answer, finding a quiet alcove between towering racks of Bordeaux. The thermostat sabotage confirms systematic intent, I reported quietly. But the real target wasn't just the Romanée Conti. Someone stole Marco's chef's heart, a wooden box containing his personal recipes and culinary philosophy. Elena Rodriguez confirms it was positioned behind the wine as security. Ah. Wolfe's voice carried the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were being confirmed with mathematical precision. The wine was valuable camouflage for theft of something irreplaceable. And Mr. Quine's knowledge of positioning details? Too specific for research, too accurate for coincidence. He's demonstrated intimate familiarity with Marco's private collection methods. Indeed. The honey evidence you observed earlier, examine it more carefully. Montenegrin wildflower, honey has distinctive properties that leave specific traces. I returned to find the group still gathered around the violated inner cage. Using my pocket flashlight, I examined the remaining bottles for traces of the honey that had marked our amuse-bouche service. On a lower shelf, partially hidden behind a bottle of vintage Armagnac, I found what Wolfe had anticipated, a sticky residue that caught the light like amber, carrying the unmistakable scent of mountain meadows and carefully laid plans. "Honey," I announced, indicating the traces. Someone with honey on their fingers handled bottles in this cage. The same honey used in tonight's Montenegrin quince preparation. Marcus Webb had been unusually quiet during our cellar investigation, his nervous energy focused into something approaching panic. Now he cleared his throat with the desperate courage of someone who decided confession was preferable to discovery. "I carried the amuse-bouche tray," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "Ms. Reeve asked me to stage it for photography. She said she wanted shots of the authentic presentation." He swallowed hard. "An envelope came this morning, cash and instructions. Use the service corridor. Stage the tray in the blue room. Don't speak to kitchen staff." I thought it was artistic direction. "The envelope?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Quine Hospitality courier sticker," he confirmed miserably. I assumed it was legitimate business coordination. The pieces were falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed trap finally springing shut. Jasper Quine stood among us like a man watching his carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. His earlier confidence replaced by the cold calculation of someone reassessing escape routes. Elena Rodriguez stared at him with the focused intensity of someone who just recognized a wolf in expensive clothing. "You're not an investor at all, are you, Mr. Quine? You're someone who had legitimate access to Marco's collection, someone who knew his methods, his security arrangements, his most precious possessions." "Former sommelier," Quine confirmed with bitter satisfaction. "Marco dismissed me 18 months ago over what he called creative inventory management. I prefer to think of tonight as collecting severance compensation with appropriate interest." Dr. Blackwood adjusted his glasses with academic precision. "So the legal documents, the dinner theater, the authentication performance, all elaborate misdirection to disguise systematic theft of both valuable wine and irreplaceable intellectual property." "Sophisticated misdirection," Daphne added with what might have been professional admiration if the circumstances had been different. "Using authentic recipes and legitimate grievances to create credible witnesses for insurance fraud while conducting the real business in the basement." My phone buzzed with a text from Seoul. "Warehouse activity concluded. 3 men departed with cases and satchel. Photographed license plates and faces. Building now secured but empty." I pocketed the phone and addressed our assembled group of thieves, victims, and unwitting accomplices. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears the evening's entertainment has concluded in the basement. The question now is whether we conclude it here with civilized conversation, or whether we wait for Inspector Kramer to provide official closure." Quine's smile returned, but now it carried the sharp edges of a man with nothing left to lose. Mr. Goodwin, you have theories and circumstantial evidence. What you don't have is proof of criminal intent or recoverable stolen property. My legal counsel will be very interested in your accusations. Will they? I asked with genuine curiosity. Because Nero Wolfe has a particular way of handling cases that involve the desecration of old friendships. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, you're invited to his office to discuss the matter in detail. Bring your counsel. Bring your appetite for truth. You'll need both. As we prepared to return to the Blue Room for what promised to be a very interesting dessert course, I found myself reflecting on the evening's elaborate deception. Someone had invested considerable time, money, and expertise in creating an authentic menu of death, complete with genuine recipes, legitimate wines, and carefully orchestrated theater. But they'd made one critical error. They'd used Marko Vukcic's memory as bait to hook Nero Wolfe. That made it personal. And when something becomes personal for Wolfe, he doesn't just solve the case, he orchestrates a reckoning that ensures justice is served with appropriate seasoning. The chocolate tart with blood orange sorbet awaited us upstairs, along with whatever final revelations the evening had prepared. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe promises 11 o'clock appointments, the dessert course usually includes a generous helping of comeuppance, served at precisely the right temperature for maximum effect. The return to the Blue Room carried the subdued atmosphere of a wake where the deceased had been caught with their hand in the collection plate. The chocolate tart with blood orange sorbet awaited us like a verdict, dark, rich, and carrying the weight of the evening's revelations. The inscription on the menu seemed particularly pointed now. Your last taste should be honest. Someone had invested considerable irony in their planning. Our server, whose nervous tremor had progressed from subtle to obvious, positioned dessert plates with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required ignoring whatever drama was unfolding at table 6. The room had cooled several degrees, though whether from the November air or the company was difficult to determine. Daphne Reeves sat with the rigid posture of someone whose carefully orchestrated performance had collapsed beyond salvage. Her legal documents lay scattered across the white linen like evidence at a crime scene, which I was beginning to understand. They essentially were. The portfolio that had contained her leverage now seemed as empty as her prospects for avoiding criminal charges. Jasper Quine attacked his dessert with mechanical efficiency, but his earlier confidence had evaporated completely. The sommelier's expertise that had seemed impressive during dinner now appeared sinister in light of what we'd discovered in the cellar. His knowledge of Marko's collection hadn't come from research. It had come from intimate, professional access that he'd abused for personal gain. Elena Rodriguez pushed her plate away untouched, her attention focused on the scattered legal documents with growing recognition. She held one of the partnership agreements up to the candlelight, examining the paper with professional attention. "This watermark is wrong," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found a smoking gun. "This particular pattern wasn't introduced by the manufacturer until 2018, but the document is dated 2016. The typeface is wrong too. Produced on a modern laser printer, not the IBM Selectric that Marko actually used for business correspondence." Dr. Blackwood leaned forward with academic interest. "Anachronistic evidence. The forger used contemporary materials to create historical documents, a fundamental error in authentication." "More than an error," I observed, noting how Daphne's hands had begun to tremble slightly. "It's proof of deliberate fraud. Someone went to considerable trouble to create these documents, but they made critical mistakes that any expert examination would reveal." Before I could press further, something caught my attention, a small detail that had been nagging at me since the first course. The theatrical killer placard that had been centered on the table before dinner was nowhere to be seen. I'd noticed it missing during the meal but hadn't pursued the observation. I stood and circled the table with casual interest, stopping beside Daphne's chair. "Odd thing," I said conversationally, "how that killer placard that was centered on this table before the first course vanished between courses. I've been wondering where it went." Daphne's purse sat beside her chair, positioned with the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of keeping evidence close. As I spoke, her hand moved instinctively toward it, a gesture that confirmed my suspicions. "May I?" I asked, indicating the purse with polite interest. "That's private property," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "So was Marco's wine collection," Elena Rodriguez observed with sharp authority. "Privacy seems to be a flexible concept this evening." I didn't need to examine the purse directly. Daphne's defensive posture and nervous glances told the story clearly enough. But Marcus Webb, who had been unusually quiet during our cellar investigation, suddenly cleared his throat with the desperate courage of someone who decided confession was preferable to discovery. "I may have a photo," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "Reference shot from this afternoon. I was documenting the color temperature in that cafe window on Madison Avenue." He produced his phone with trembling fingers. "Ms. Reeve meeting with someone. I thought it was just interesting composition." The image on his phone screen was damning in its clarity. Daphne in profile at the cafe table, a small brass key glinting between her fingers as she passed it to a tall man with prematurely gray hair. The man's face was turned just enough to show sharp features and calculating eyes. Not Jasper Quine, but someone who carried himself with similar professional confidence. "Alan Voss," I said, recognizing the face from Saul's earlier description. "Quine's logistics coordinator, former wine distributor who joined Quine's operation 6 months ago." Quine's careful composure finally showed its first real crack. "Circumstantial evidence," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier smoothness. "Business meetings occur constantly in this city." "Business meetings that involve brass keys and careful timing," I replied. "The key Ms. Reeve transferred wasn't for general cellar access. It was specifically for the inner cage where Marco kept his most valuable possessions." My phone buzzed with a call from Wolfe. I stepped toward the service entrance and answered with the discretion that sensitive conversations require. "The dessert course has revealed additional evidence," I reported quietly, briefing him on Elena's document analysis, the missing placard, and Marcus's photographic evidence. "The forged documents show anachronistic materials, and we have visual proof of the key transfer to Quine's associate." "Excellent." Wolfe's voice carried the satisfaction of a man whose theories were being confirmed with mathematical precision. "The systematic nature of the deception becomes clear. Mr. Quine orchestrated a multi-layered scheme: document fraud to create legal leverage, theatrical dinner to provide witnesses, and misdirection and systematic theft of both wine and intellectual property during the performance. The chef's heart was the real target. Indeed, the wine represents monetary value, but Marco's personal recipes and techniques represent irreplaceable intellectual property. Someone could build an entire culinary empire on that knowledge, claiming Marco's innovations as their own discoveries. What about Inspector Kramer? Already notified and en route, the evidence is comprehensive enough to warrant immediate arrest and search warrants for Mr. Quine's properties. But Archie, ensure that all parties understand they are expected at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Justice requires more than arrest. It demands complete exposure of the scheme's scope and malicious intent. When I returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Elena Rodriguez was holding the forged partnership agreement like evidence in a trial, while Daphne's careful facade showed increasing strain under the weight of accumulated revelations. Celia Garros appeared at the service entrance, her expression mixing professional concern with genuine alarm. "Mr. Goodwin, Inspector Kramer is en route. Also, our security system recorded the service corridor activity during dinner. The footage shows someone accessing the cellar with unauthorized keys at precisely the time the amuse-bouche was being served upstairs. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had orchestrated the evening with military precision, using the dinner performance to provide cover for systematic theft. The authentic Montenegrin quince preparation hadn't just been theatrical flourish. It had been a signal that the real business was beginning in the basement. Jasper Quine stood with the careful dignity of a man who'd realized his sophisticated scheme was collapsing but refused to abandon his performance entirely. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an educational evening. However, I believe circumstances now require legal counsel rather than dinner conversation. They do indeed, I agreed. Inspector Kramer will want statements from everyone present, and federal prosecutors will be interested in the intellectual property theft charges. But first, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, you're all invited to Nero Wolfe's office for a complete exposition of tonight's events. And if we decline, Dr. Blackwood asked with academic precision, then you'll explain your decision to Inspector Kramer and the federal agents who will be investigating the systematic theft of irreplaceable culinary intellectual property. Mr. Wolfe prefers to handle such matters with appropriate discretion, but justice will be served regardless of venue. Victoria Sterling's laugh carried bitter appreciation. How wonderfully civilized. We're being offered the choice between private humiliation and public prosecution. You're being offered the opportunity to understand the full scope of what you've witnessed, I corrected. Tonight's performance was more elaborate than any of you realized, and the consequences extend far beyond wine theft and document fraud. As sirens became audible in the distance, Elena Rodriguez gathered the scattered legal documents with methodical care. These forgeries need to be preserved as evidence, she said with professional authority. Marco's reputation deserves official vindication, not just private justice. The chocolate tart was excellent, but I barely tasted it. My attention was focused on watching professional criminals realize that their sophisticated scheme had collapsed not because of police work or legal investigation, but because they'd underestimated Nero Wolfe's commitment to preserving the memory of old friendships. Inspector Kramer arrived with 2 uniformed officers and the weary expression of someone who'd learned that cases involving Nero Wolfe usually required overtime and extensive paperwork. His eyes moved around the blue room, cataloging evidence and assessing the assembled suspects with professional efficiency. Mr. Goodwin, he said with familiar resignation, I understand we have wine theft, document fraud, and what appears to be intellectual property theft on a scale that might interest federal prosecutors. Inspector, it's been an educational evening. The evidence is comprehensive. The confessions have been illuminating, and the stolen property has been tracked to specific locations. Mr. Wolfe expects you for coffee tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, before the 11 o'clock appointment with the principals. Kramer nodded with the resignation of someone who'd learned to work within Wolfe's preferred procedures. All right, let's start with statements and evidence collection. This is going to be a long night. As the inspector began processing the scene, I reflected on the evening's elaborate deception. Someone had invested months of planning in creating an authentic menu of death, complete with genuine recipes, legitimate wines, forged legal documents, and carefully orchestrated theater. But they'd made one critical error. They'd chosen to desecrate the memory of Marko Vukcic, and that made it personal for Nero Wolfe. The menu of death had indeed lived up to its theatrical billing, but the casualties were professional reputations and criminal freedom rather than actual mortality. Tomorrow's 11 o'clock appointment would provide the final course in this elaborate meal, served with the kind of comprehensive justice that Nero Wolfe preferred. Truth revealed, consequences delivered, and old friendships properly honored. The chocolate tart was perfect, but I found myself looking forward to tomorrow's coffee more than tonight's dessert. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe promises complete exposition of a case involving stolen memories and desecrated friendships, the final revelations are always worth the wait. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, West 35th Street had settled into that particular Manhattan quiet that comes after midnight. Not silence exactly, but the kind of urban hush that suggests the city is catching its breath between acts. Fritz had left a covered plate on the kitchen table with a note in his precise script. "Archie, eat this. The leeks will not improve with waiting, and neither will your disposition." I ate the braised leeks and ham tucked into one of his perfect rolls, the kind of simple perfection that makes complicated evenings feel manageable, and carried my report to the office. Wolfe hadn't retired. He sat behind his desk with perhaps half an inch of beer remaining in his glass, and the expression he wears when someone has been foolish enough to challenge his particular expertise. I gave him the sequence without embellishment. The cellar sabotage, Elena's document analysis revealing anachronistic watermarks, the missing Romane Conti and the dust shadow where Marco's chef's heart had rested, the honey residue behind the Armagnac, Quine's slip about bottle positioning that no amount of research could explain, Marcus's inadvertent photograph of the key transfer, and Kramer's arrival with federal agents in tow. He listened without interruption except to grunt once when I described the thermostat Brad. When I finished, he drained the last of his beer and set the glass down with the soft precision of punctuation. "The wooden box," he said. "Describe the dust pattern dimensions." Approximately 9 by 6 by 3 inches. Old wood, judging by the shadow depth and the way dust had accumulated around the edges. Large enough for folded papers and small notebooks. Too large for an evening purse, appropriate for a critic's leather portfolio. He closed his eyes briefly. The wine theft was theatrical misdirection, Archie. The forged documents were leverage for negotiation, but the theft of that box was the true objective. Marco's irreplaceable intellectual legacy, his personal recipes and culinary philosophy. My phone buzzed with a text from Saul. "Blackwood stopped at Gazette Building. In and out 8 minutes with Satchel. Night security confirms archive room access. Can return at dawn if needed." "The good doctor," Wolfe murmured when I relayed this, "possesses the instincts of a librarian combined with the ethics of an opportunist. He will claim he was preserving the materials for scholarly purposes, but preservation and appropriation often wear similar masks." I called Saul back and arranged for morning surveillance of the newspaper's archive room. By the time these arrangements were complete, Wolfe had already reached for his book, a signal that further discussion could wait for daylight and proper coffee. At 8:30 the next morning, Inspector Kramer arrived with the weary satisfaction of a man whose overnight had concluded with comprehensive arrests and recovered evidence. He settled into his usual chair with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd learned that cases involving Nero Wolfe required patience, overtime, and considerable paperwork. "Federal agents processed Quine's warehouse until dawn," he reported, accepting coffee from Fritz with genuine gratitude. "Complete wine collection recovered, along with detailed business plans for a restaurant franchise operation using stolen intellectual property. Also found architectural drawings, menu development using Marco's recipes, and marketing materials, positioning Quine as heir to a legendary culinary tradition." The scope exceeded simple theft, Wolfe observed. "Considerably. This was systematic appropriation of an entire professional legacy. Federal prosecutors are calling it one of the most sophisticated intellectual property theft schemes they've encountered in the hospitality industry." At 9:15, we recovered Marco's chef's heart from the Gazette archives. Dr. Blackwood had positioned it carefully among legitimate restaurant industry research materials, wrapped in acid-free paper with a note claiming temporary custodial preservation pending proper archival assessment. The wooden box itself was simple, worn smooth by decades of handling, and carried the faint aroma of old paper, dried herbs, and memories that couldn't be replicated. Kramer examined the box with professional interest. "Fingerprints?" "Dr. Blackwood's, certainly. Possibly others. But the contents represent irreplaceable intellectual property, personal recipes, technique notes, philosophical observations about cuisine that Marco never intended for public consumption." At 11 o'clock precisely, our principals began arriving for what promised to be a comprehensive exposition of the previous evening's elaborate deception. Elena Rodriguez entered first, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who discovered that old friendships had been more valuable than she'd realized. Dr. Blackwood followed, his academic composure showing strain around the edges. Daphne Reeve arrived in federal custody, her expensive evening wear replaced by institutional orange and her carefully constructed confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose sophisticated schemes had collapsed into criminal charges. Her attorney, a nervous young man who clearly wished he'd chosen tax law, positioned himself with the defensive posture that hopeless cases require. Jasper Quine entered last, accompanied by legal counsel whose expensive suit couldn't quite mask his client's diminished circumstances. Quine himself maintained his polished exterior, but something behind his eyes had gone cold and calculating, the look of a man reassessing his options and finding them limited. I arranged them in the office according to Wolfe's preferences. The honest parties nearest the light, the guilty where they had to look uphill to see him. Fritz provided coffee, with a dignity that shamed several of them into thank yous, then withdrew with a silent efficiency that delicate situations require. Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with satisfaction, reached for his beer, and began his exposition with the methodical precision that complex revelations demand. "Before we address individual culpability," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we must establish the scope of what was attempted. This was not simple theft motivated by immediate financial need. This was systematic desecration of a man's legacy, orchestrated by someone whose professional dismissal had festered into personal vendetta." He turned his attention to Jasper Quine with the focused intensity of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You were dismissed from Marco's employ 18 months ago for what he termed creative inventory management. You resented not merely the loss of position, but the public humiliation of dismissal from an establishment you considered beneath your expertise. You sought revenge that would wound Marco's reputation posthumously, while providing you with the means to establish your own culinary empire on his stolen innovations." Quine's attorney started to object, but Wolfe continued with inexorable logic. The forged partnership agreements were designed to suggest that Marco had cheated his collaborators and stolen their intellectual contributions. Miss Reeve's legitimate grievances provided credible foundation for these claims, while Dr. Blackwood's academic reputation would lend scholarly weight to any eventual discovery of Marco's alleged intellectual theft. Elena Rodriguez leaned forward with sharp attention. "The documents I examined contained fundamental errors that no legitimate agreement would include. The watermarks were anachronistic, the typography was wrong, and the legal language reflected contemporary rather than historical usage." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "The forger possessed skill in reproduction but lacked intimate knowledge of the period's actual business practices. More significantly, the partnership clause regarding exclusive rights to derivative works, the language that Miss Rodriguez immediately recognized as rejected by Marco, proved that these documents were based on preliminary drafts rather than executed agreements." Dr. Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with academic precision. "I must protest, Mr. Wolfe. My involvement was purely curatorial. When I recognized the value of the materials, I felt obligated to preserve them for scholarly study." "You felt obligated to steal them," Wolfe corrected with quiet authority. "The box containing Marco's personal recipes and culinary philosophy was not abandoned property requiring scholarly rescue. It was deliberately stolen intellectual property that you appropriated under the pretense of academic preservation." The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock marking time in the hallway. Wolfe reached into his desk drawer and produced the morning's envelope, the one that had been slipped under our door with its forged Montenegrin recipe and honey-scented margins. "This morning's attempted bribe," he said, holding up the paper, "represents the final insult. Someone believed that Marco's memory could be purchased with crude forgeries and theatrical gestures. The diacritical marks are incorrect, the technique description is incomplete, and the honey used to scent the paper was applied with obvious artifice. Daphne Reeves' composure finally cracked completely. The legal pressure was supposed to be sufficient, she said, her voice tight with strain. The dinner, the documents, the authentication performance, it was meant to create leverage for negotiation, not criminal conspiracy. Yet you participated willingly in document fraud, theft of irreplaceable intellectual property, and systematic sabotage of valuable wine collection, Wolfe observed. Your financial desperation may explain your motivation, Miss Reeve, but it does not excuse your methods. Inspector Kramer stepped forward with the satisfaction of a man whose evidence was comprehensive and his case was solid. Jasper Quine, you're under arrest for grand larceny, conspiracy, fraud, and theft of intellectual property. Miss Reeve, you're also under arrest on similar charges. As the federal agents led them away, Dr. Blackwood sat with the defeated posture of someone whose academic reputation had been permanently compromised by a moment of opportunistic greed. Elena Rodriguez approached Wolfe's desk carrying the recovered wooden box. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've not only recovered Marco's legacy, you've preserved his honor." Wolfe accepted the box with reverent care, his massive hands gentle as he examined the worn wood that had contained his old friend's most precious thoughts. Some things, Ms. Rodriguez, transcend monetary value. Marco's intellectual legacy, his approach to cuisine, his philosophical understanding of hospitality, these represent irreplaceable cultural treasure that no amount of money could restore once lost. After the others had departed, I found Wolfe in the plant rooms, contemplating a particularly vibrant Cattleya orchid with the peaceful satisfaction of a man whose intellectual appetite had been thoroughly satisfied. A successful resolution, I observed. The menu of death turned out to be a menu of justice, after all. Indeed, Archie, the irony is appropriate. Someone attempted to use Marco's own recipes to orchestrate his posthumous humiliation, but instead provided the means for complete vindication of his reputation and recovery of his stolen legacy. He paused, studying the orchid's complex beauty with the appreciation that only genuine expertise can provide. The evening's final course proved most instructive. When someone attempts to profit from the desecration of friendship, they invariably underestimate the power of loyalty and the enduring value of integrity. Mr. Quine discovered that some debts compound beyond the capacity of even sophisticated criminals to repay. The brown stone settled back into its familiar rhythm, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Marco Vukcic's memory had been vindicated, his legacy preserved, and his chef's heart returned to appropriate custodianship. The elaborate menu of death had indeed provided its promised entertainment, though the casualties were professional reputations and criminal freedom rather than actual mortality. Fritz appeared with lunch, a simple but perfect omelette with herbs from his garden, served with the kind of quiet pride that honest work deserves. As we ate, Wolfe offered his final observation on the case. The most dangerous criminals, Archie, are those who believe their sophistication elevates them above common morality. Mr. Quine orchestrated an elaborate scheme worthy of considerable admiration, had it been applied to legitimate purposes. Instead, he chose to desecrate friendship for profit and discovered that some violations carry consequences beyond legal punishment. Justice, he concluded, raising his glass of beer with ceremonial precision, like properly aged wine, should be savored for its complexity, its depth, and its ultimately satisfying finish. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the warm air. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal conversation of ambition and achievement, but inside the brownstone on West 35th Street, all was quiet satisfaction and the peaceful certainty that some things, friendship, integrity, and the honor of old memories, remain beyond the reach of those who mistake sophistication for wisdom. The menu of death had been served, consumed, and properly digested. The final taste, as promised, had been honest. The federal agents had barely cleared the brownstone's front steps when Fritz appeared in the office doorway, with the expression he wore when something was fundamentally wrong with the universe's proper order. He carried a silver tray bearing coffee and what appeared to be a note written in his precise script. "Archie," he said, his German accent thicker than usual. "There is a matter requiring attention. The wooden box, I was preparing proper storage when I noticed something irregular." Wolfe looked up from the evening paper he'd been attempting to read, despite the lingering chaos of arrests and evidence collection. His eyes moved to the recovered chef's heart sitting on the side table, then to Fritz's troubled expression. "Show me," Wolfe said simply. Fritz approached the box with the reverence he usually reserved for soufflés and aged cheese. He opened the lid carefully, revealing Marco's papers arranged with mathematical precision. But something in the organization was wrong. A gap where pages should have aligned, a disruption in the careful sequence that suggested tampering. "One sheet is missing," Fritz said quietly. "From the section on emulsion techniques, the dust pattern shows where it rested, but the page itself is gone." Elena Rodriguez, who had remained to help catalog the recovered materials, leaned forward with sharp attention. She examined the gap with professional precision, her fingers hovering over the disturbed papers without touching them. The missing page contained Marco's technique for stabilizing citrus curds under heat, she said, her voice carrying new concern. It was revolutionary work, a method for binding sweetness to heat that prevented separation during service. Commercial applications would be enormous. I was already reaching for the phone to call Saul when it buzzed with an incoming message. His text was brief but illuminating. Blackwood returned to Gazette Building 20 minutes ago. Archive room access logged. Night security reports unusual urgency. "Dr. Blackwood," I said, showing the message to Wolfe. "Our scholarly thief isn't finished with his preservation work." Wolfe's expression darkened with the particular displeasure he reserved for people who compounded their offenses through persistence. "Call Inspector Kramer, then call Dr. Blackwood and invite him to return here immediately. His academic curiosity requires immediate correction." While I made the calls, Elena continued examining the box with growing recognition of what had been stolen. "This wasn't random pilfering," she said with quiet anger. "Whoever took that page understood its specific value. The technique described could revolutionize dessert preparation in high-end restaurants." Kramer arrived within 30 minutes, his earlier satisfaction replaced by the weary recognition that cases involving Nero Wolfe rarely concluded with simple arrests. He examined the evidence of the missing page with professional attention, then listened to my report on Blackwood's archive activities with growing irritation. "Academic theft," he muttered, shaking his head, "as if we didn't have enough complications with wine fraud and document forgery." Dr. Blackwood arrived at 8:15, accompanied by the nervous energy of someone who'd realized his scholarly reputation was balanced on the edge of a very sharp blade. He carried his leather satchel with defensive precision and wore the expression of a man preparing to justify the unjustifiable. Wolfe didn't offer him a chair. Instead, he gestured toward the open box on the side table with the kind of gesture that made accusations unnecessary. "Dr. Blackwood," Wolfe said with quiet authority, "you have compounded theft with academic fraud. Return the page." "I was preserving it," Blackwood replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "The technique described represents significant culinary innovation that deserves proper documentation and study." "It deserves to remain where Marco placed it," Elena interjected with sharp authority. That page contains personal notes, experimental ratios, and philosophical observations that were never intended for publication or commercial exploitation. Kramer stepped forward with the patience of someone who'd learned to let Wolfe conduct intellectual interrogations before applying legal pressure. Dr. Blackwood, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Your choice. The academic facade finally cracked completely. Blackwood reached into his satchel and produced a single sheet in a protective plastic sleeve, along with a thumb drive that presumably contained digital copies. His hands trembled slightly as he placed both items on Wolfe's desk. I made one scan, he admitted quietly, for scholarly purposes. The technique could benefit the entire culinary community. Under your name, no doubt, Wolfe observed with distaste. Sir, you have demonstrated that academic credentials provide no immunity against common theft. Your scholarly purposes mask commercial ambition as surely as Mr. Quine's investment research masked systematic fraud. Elena accepted the recovered page with visible relief, examining it carefully before returning it to its proper place in the box. The restoration of Marco's complete intellectual legacy seemed to settle something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Celia Garros, who had arrived during the confrontation, watched the page's return with quiet satisfaction. The trustees will need to establish proper security protocols, she said. This box represents irreplaceable cultural heritage that requires institutional protection. Indeed, Wolfe agreed. Arrange a meeting with Marco's estate attorney and appropriate culinary historians. The materials require professional custodianship that balances preservation with protection from academic opportunists. After Kramer departed with Blackwood and the digital evidence, the office settled into the kind of quiet that follows the resolution of complex problems. Fritz appeared with dinner, a simple but perfect meal that honored Marco's philosophy of excellence through precision rather than pretension. As we ate, Wolfe offered his final observations on the case that had begun with theatrical menace and concluded with comprehensive justice. The most insidious criminals, Archie, are those who exploit noble purposes for corrupt ends. Mr. Quine used legitimate business methods to mask systematic theft. Ms. Reeve used authentic grievances to justify document fraud. Dr. Blackwood used scholarly preservation to rationalize intellectual piracy. Each believed their sophistication elevated them above common morality, but sophistication without integrity is merely elaborate criminality. They underestimated the power of genuine friendship and the dangerous consequences of using someone's memory as leverage for personal gain. Elena Rodriguez called as we finished dinner, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional obligations had been properly fulfilled. The Culinary Institute had agreed to provide secure archival services for Marco's papers, with access restricted to legitimate researchers and Elena maintaining curatorial oversight. The box will be properly preserved, she reported, but more importantly, Marco's reputation has been completely vindicated. The attempted theft and fraud have only emphasized the genuine value of his contributions to culinary arts. Victoria Sterling arrived unexpectedly as evening settled over the brownstone, carrying herself with the subdued elegance of someone who'd learned that dinner parties could have consequences extending far beyond social embarrassment. She declined refreshment, but accepted the opportunity to explain her unwitting participation in Quine's scheme. He presented it as cultural preservation, she said with quiet regret. The initial materials were compelling, recovering lost recipes, documenting traditional techniques, honoring culinary heritage. I never suspected the true purpose was systematic appropriation for commercial exploitation. Sophisticated criminals excel at recruiting honest people for dishonest purposes, Wolfe observed, with characteristic precision. Your experience illustrates why vigilance must accompany good intentions, particularly when dealing with those who understand that cultural heritage represents valuable commercial commodity. After Victoria departed, The brownstone exhaled into its familiar evening rhythm. Fritz cleared the dinner service with quiet efficiency. Wolfe reached for his current book, and I settled the day's correspondence. The menu of death had been served, consumed, and properly digested, with justice delivered in appropriate portions. My phone buzzed with a final message from Saul. Federal agents recovered additional stolen materials from Blackwood's office. Complete inventory of Quine's operation suggests 17 planned restaurant locations using appropriated techniques. Case closed. Criminals in custody. Legacy preserved. I showed the message to Wolfe, who grunted with satisfaction before returning to his reading. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal conversation of ambition and achievement, but inside the brownstone on West 35th Street, all was quiet satisfaction and the peaceful certainty that some things, friendship, integrity, and the honor of old memories, remain beyond the reach of those who mistake sophistication for wisdom. The case had demonstrated that even the most elaborate criminal schemes could be unraveled by careful attention to detail, genuine expertise, and the enduring power of loyalty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to the satisfaction of justice properly served and friendship appropriately honored. Fritz appeared in the doorway with his evening tray. "Coffee, sir, and perhaps a small cognac to settle the evening's complexities?" "Excellent suggestion, Fritz," I replied, noting how the successful resolution of Marco's case had restored the proper order to our small corner of the universe. Tonight calls for celebration of work well done and justice appropriately delivered. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another successful conclusion to a case that had tested both intellect and loyalty. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe promises that justice will be served with appropriate discretion, the final result is always worth the wait, and tonight's conclusion proved no exception to that reliable rule. The city did what it always does after a ruckus. It smoothed its jacket, straightened its tie, and pretended nothing had happened. By noon the next day, Rusterman's was taking lunch reservations as if the previous evening had been a wine tasting rather than a systematic exposure of theft, fraud, and the desecration of memory. Celia called to report that the Blue Room had been scrubbed clean of honey residue, theatrical placards, and the lingering scent of criminal ambition. The mail arrived with its usual mixture of bills, correspondence, and trouble wrapped in expensive envelopes. 2 letters bore the return addresses of attorneys, one from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming federal charges against Jasper Quine and requesting Wolfe's availability for deposition, the other from the Gazette's legal counsel offering to facilitate a clarification regarding Dr. Blackwood's role in what they termed cultural preservation activities. Wolfe read both, grunted with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions had proved accurate, and instructed me to file them under tedium inevitable. At 3:30, a messenger brought a carefully wrapped package from Elena Rodriguez. Inside was a bound inventory of Marco's recovered papers, prepared overnight by a team at the Culinary Institute. The cover bore a simple inscription: "The Vukshik Papers, restricted access, provenance restored." Attached was a note in Elena's precise handwriting. "Marco's legacy is now properly protected. His innovations will serve future generations under his own name, as they were always meant to do." I carried the inventory to Wolfe's office, where he examined it with the reverence usually reserved for rare orchids or Fritz's soufflés. He read slowly, occasionally tapping a line with approval when a phrase particularly pleased him. When he finished, he placed the inventory on his desk blotter and regarded it the way he looks at a cattleya that has bloomed exactly as expected. "Restitution," he said with quiet satisfaction. Inspector Kramer called that evening with a comprehensive wrap-up that complex cases require. Quine faced federal charges for intellectual property theft, wine fraud, and conspiracy. His elaborate restaurant franchise scheme, built on stolen culinary innovations, had collapsed entirely. Daphne Reeve would serve time for document fraud and conspiracy. Her investment consulting career permanently ended. Dr. Blackwood had been placed on indefinite leave pending criminal prosecution, his academic reputation destroyed by his theft of irreplaceable cultural materials. The killer placard turned up in Daphne's purse, Kramer reported with grim satisfaction, complete with honey streaks and her fingerprints. Quine's warehouse yielded enough evidence to stock a prosecutor's office for months. Your friend Saul's photographs of the license plates led us to the whole operation. Fritz announced dinner at 7 with the solemnity he brought to occasions that qualified as restorative in his personal theology. He had prepared bœuf à la mode with carrots from his garden and braised endive that could have converted a longshoreman to civility. Notably absent from the menu was anything involving quince. Fritz treated that preparation like a sacred relic that had been temporarily profaned and required time to recover its proper dignity. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need conversation because the food itself was providing all necessary communication. The familiar rhythms of the brownstone, the grandfather clock's measured chiming, the soft sounds of Fritz clearing dishes, the distant hum of Manhattan evening traffic restored the proper order to our small corner of the universe. When we moved to the office for coffee, I delivered the final pieces of the resolution. Victoria Sterling had established a scholarship fund at the Culinary Institute in Marco's name, focused on ethics in culinary innovation. Celia Garros had announced plans for an annual memorial dinner, not a theatrical spectacle, but a quiet celebration of Marco's contributions to culinary art, with proceeds supporting the scholarship program. The Gazette had quietly transferred Dr. Blackwood to their obituary department, where his expertise in preserving the dead would be more appropriately applied. Wolfe listened to these reports with the satisfaction of a man whose sense of justice had been properly served. When I finished, he reached for an envelope that had arrived by special messenger that afternoon. Inside was a note on Rusterman's letterhead, written in Celia's precise script. Mr. Wolfe, Table 6 will remain permanently reserved on the anniversary of Marco's death. Should you ever decide to break a rule and dine with us, I can promise no theatrics, no performances, no elaborate presentations. Only gratitude, properly seasoned, and served at the correct temperature. Below Celia's signature was another, in the careful handwriting I recognized immediately as Fritz's. The sight of it made something catch in my throat. Fritz had never signed anything connected to dining outside the brownstone, but apparently some occasions transcended even his fierce loyalty to domestic routine. Wolfe read the invitation and set it aside without comment, but I didn't miss the way his eyelids lowered briefly, or how his hand rested momentarily on the inventory of Marco's papers, as if drawing warmth from the connection. Justice served at the proper temperature, he said finally, reaching for his beer with ceremonial precision. Mr. Quine overreached because revenge is a glutton. It feeds until it sickens the host. Miss Reeve mistook grievance for license. Dr. Blackwood confused vanity with virtue. Their intelligence was adequate, but their appetites were fundamentally disordered. He took a measured sip and continued with the philosophical precision that complex cases always inspired in him. Theft of money is vulgar but comprehensible. Theft of technique is worse but still within the bounds of common criminality. But theft of reputation, the systematic desecration of a man's legacy for personal profit, that represents a moral bankruptcy that no amount of sophistication can disguise. They attempted all three violations simultaneously, believing their elaborate presentation would mask the essential vulgarity of their enterprise. It is well that the law will punish their crimes, posterity will correct their misrepresentations, and we, with our friends, have restored the honor they sought to steal. I poured myself a brandy from the bottle Fritz had left on the side table, a 1947 Hennessy that seemed appropriate for toasting the successful conclusion of a case involving vintage wines and aged memories. That leaves the question of dessert, I said. Fritz would object to calling cognac a proper final course, but I've seen you bend stricter categories when circumstances warrant. Wolfe ignored my levity with the dignity that serious subjects deserve. We will return Marco's papers to Ms. Rodriguez tomorrow and accept no fee beyond our standard rate. Inform Ms. Garros that while I will not dine in public, she may send me a list of available wines for small private acquisition. I will select 3 bottles and pay market value. Tell her it is not compensation. It is acknowledgement of Marco's memory, of friendship properly honored, he corrected, and the way he said it made the steam rising from his coffee cup seem like incense offered at an appropriate altar. Later, after Fritz had cleared the service with the reverence he brought to occasions that qualified as sacred in his personal canon, I asked the question that had been waiting since Celia's invitation arrived. If you ever did decide to break a rule about dining out? No, he said with finality. Rules exist because someone paid for them with experience, and I have no right to squander that purchase. I shared many meals with Marco at his table when friendship was new and the future seemed infinite. I do not require an audience to remember him properly. I let that stand because experience had taught me when to stop pressing with Wolfe. The office settled into its familiar evening posture, the comfortable silence of work completed and justice appropriately delivered. Through the windows came the layered sounds of Manhattan evening. Distant laughter, a car horn's brief complaint, footsteps on pavement carrying their own stories toward uncertain destinations. From the kitchen came the sound of Fritz humming something Wagnerian, apparently having forgiven the universe for what it had attempted to do to quince and Montenegrin culinary traditions. The brownstone exhaled into its proper rhythms, the grandfather clock marking time with mechanical precision, the steam radiators beginning their evening symphony of expansion and settlement. Before retiring, I called Saul to close his file on the case. He reported, in his characteristically dry manner, that all necessary surveillance had been completed, all required photographs had been taken, and all appropriate warnings had been delivered to parties who might consider similar enterprises in the future. He mentioned that his bill would make me wince, but that I'd pay it without argument, which was probably accurate on both counts. When I passed through the office on my way upstairs, Wolfe was still at his desk with the inventory of Marco's papers open to a page covered in the old chef's distinctive handwriting. He wasn't reading anymore, just looking, which anyone who didn't know Wolfe might mistake for the same thing. It wasn't. He closed the inventory with a palm that covered most of it and looked at me directly. Archie, I've observed more than once that appetite encompasses far more than mere hunger. It involves the mind, the spirit, the moral imagination. An ordered appetite honors what it consumes and finds satisfaction in appropriate measure. A disordered appetite devours without discrimination and remains perpetually unsatisfied. This case represented an attempt by disordered minds to gorge themselves on what they had not earned, could not appreciate, and did not deserve. They discovered that some fare proves indigestible to those who lack the proper seasoning of integrity. Prison food rarely provides adequate seasoning, I observed. He grunted, which could have indicated agreement, indigestion, or philosophical satisfaction. Turn out the lights, Archie, and see that Fritz understands he is not to bring quince into this house for at least a month. I will not have the aroma confounded by recent associations until time has restored its proper dignity. I complied, leaving the office in darkness, except for the rectangle of streetlight on the Persian rug and the faint glow from the hallway. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, because sometimes you do when something has been properly concluded. In my room, I reflected on menus and memories, on the difference between performance and authenticity, between sophistication and wisdom. Wolfe had resolved another case without leaving his chair, orchestrating justice through pure intellectual force. A trick I'd been observing for years and still found remarkably efficient. The menu of death had lived up to its theatrical billing. though the casualties were reputations and freedom rather than actual mortality. The final course had indeed been honest, served with appropriate garnish of consequences, and seasoned with the kind of justice that leaves a lasting aftertaste. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh complications, and probably another case requiring Wolfe's particular blend of intellectual precision and moral certainty. Tonight belonged to satisfaction properly earned and friendship appropriately honored. And if you're wondering whether Fritz eventually relented and prepared Quince again, let me say this. When something sacred has been misused in your presence, you don't rush to reclaim it. You wait until it belongs to you again, clean and untainted by association with lesser purposes. In our house, that timing has a name, and it's Nero Wolfe. I wouldn't bet against his judgment on matters of such delicate importance. The brownstone settled into sleep with the satisfied silence of justice delivered and memory properly preserved. Some recipes, like some friendships, prove indestructible when prepared with the right ingredients and served at the proper temperature. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure. That authentic expertise cannot be counterfeited, that genuine friendship transcends legal documents, and that those who attempt to profit from the desecration of memory invariably discover consequences beyond their capacity to digest. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe promises justice served with appropriate discretion, the result is always worth the wait. Tonight's conclusion proved no exception to that reliable rule, 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 to that reliable rule,